Settle in and let your shoulders soften. Let the day fold itself away like a quilt at the foot of the bed. Tonight, we're going to travel slowly, not in a rush, not in a hurry, back through the years into a small green corner of the world where a quiet story once began. Picture, if you will, the gentle hills of West Virginia. The Appalachian mountains here are older than memory, worn smooth by rain and time and the patient passing of seasons. They do not rise sharply the way younger mountains do. They roll. They curve. They lean against one another like old friends sharing a long, comfortable silence. And tucked between two of those soft sleeping ridges lies a small town called Grafton. It is the early 1900s. The century has only just turned, and the world feels both very new and very old all at once. Grafton sits in a bend of the Tygart Valley River, where the water moves dark and slow under stone bridges, carrying the reflections of pine and sycamore on its back. In the early morning, mist gathers along that river like a soft gray shawl, drifting up through the laurel and the rhododendron, settling in the hollows, curling around the chimneys of the houses on the hillsides. It is a town built on rails. The trains here are the heartbeat of everything. You can hear them, even now, somewhere in the distance. The long, low call of a steam whistle echoing off the hills, the rhythmic clatter of wheels on iron, the slow exhale of a locomotive easing into the rail yard. Grafton is a junction town, a place where lines meet and part again, where coal cars from the southern mines pause on their way north, where mail bags are heaved from one platform to another, where travelers with leather suitcases step down into the small, bustling depot and breathe in the sharp, green smell of mountain air. If you were to walk through the town on a summer evening in those years, you would pass storefronts of brick and painted wood, a pharmacy with tall apothecary jars in the window, a milliner's shop with hats nested in tissue paper, a grocer setting baskets of apples and onions out under a striped awning. The streets are not yet smooth pavement. They are dust and cobblestone, packed earth and worn plank, and the soft clop of a horse's hooves still mingles with the occasional sputter of one of those new horseless carriages, rattling cautiously past. Above the rooftops, the steeples rise. Grafton is a town of churches. Their bells, when they ring on a Sunday morning, do not compete so much as answer one another, calling across the valley in a slow, layered chorus. Methodist, Baptist, Presbyterian, each spire pointing up toward a wide Appalachian sky that turns honey gold at evening and lavender at dusk and, on clear winter nights, shows so many stars it seems the whole quilt of heaven has been spread directly over the hills. And on one of those hillsides, a little above the houses, a little above the streets and the rail yard, sits a modest brick church. Its name is Andrew's Methodist Episcopal Church. Its windows are tall and arched, filled with simple panes that catch the morning light. Its sanctuary is small. Its pews are worn smooth by the hands and Sunday best of generations of Grafton families. There is nothing grand about it. It is the kind of church that smells of old hymnals and lemon oil and lilies in springtime. The kind of church where the choir is made up of neighbors and the organist has been playing the same instrument for 40 years, and everyone knows whose grandmother sat in which pew. This is the church we will return to again and again in the story we are about to tell. Because something quiet is going to happen here. Something so small and so tender that, at first, it will hardly seem like history at all. Just a daughter. Just a memory. Just a single Sunday morning, and a vase of white flowers placed gently on an altar. But that is still ahead of us. Tonight, we are simply arriving, easing into the valley, letting our eyes adjust to the soft green light of those Appalachian hills. So breathe in slowly, breathe out. Imagine the mist on the river, the whistle of a far-off train, the steeples standing patient against the sky. Imagine the little brick church on the hillside, waiting, its bells silent for now, its doors closed, its pews empty in the lamplight. We have come to Grafton, and from here the story can begin. But before we step inside that little brick church, before we hear the soft creak of its doors or watch the lamplight flicker across its quiet pews, we must turn the clock back further still. Back through the years, back through the long, slow seasons of the 19th century, to a time when Anna Jarvis was not yet a grieving daughter, not yet a woman with a vow to keep, but only a small girl, sitting at her mother's knee in a parlor in West Virginia, listening. The mother in that parlor was Reeves Jarvis. Anne with one N. The mother who started it all. She was a slender woman with a steady voice and gentle, watchful eyes. The kind of eyes that noticed when a neighbor's child had grown thin, when a young wife had stopped coming to church, when the smoke from a chimney across the valley had not risen for 2 mornings in a row. Anne was a Sunday school teacher in the small Methodist congregation in the town of Webster, and later in Grafton, in the green-folded hills of West Virginia. And she was, by every account, a woman who could not bear to see suffering without trying, in some small way, to ease it. This was not an easy century to be a mother. In those years, before clean water ran in pipes, before the simple miracles of vaccines and antibiotics, a child's first years were a long, anxious vigil. Fevers came in the night. Sickness moved from house to house like a slow, dark wind. Anne Reeves Jarvis herself bore between 11 and 13 children. The records vary, as records sometimes do, and she buried most of them. Only 4 lived to see adulthood. Imagine that. Imagine standing at so many small graves and still rising the next morning to set the kettle on the stove, to teach the Sunday lesson, to pin your hair, to go on. Anne did more than go on. She organized. In the 1850s, she gathered the women of her community and founded what she called Mothers' Day Work Clubs. They were modest groups, meeting in parlors and church basements, with no grand banner and no national charter. But the work they did was quiet and brave. The work clubs raised money for medicines. They hired women to help families where a mother had fallen ill. They taught lessons on sanitation, on how to keep a home clean, on how to feed a child through a long winter. They were, in a sense, the first quiet network of community health workers in those Appalachian hills. Women helping women, mothers helping mothers, with no thought of fame, only of the next sick child down the lane. And then came the war. The great American Civil War, with its brother-against-brother heartbreak, fell heavily on West Virginia, a borderland torn between the North and the South. Soldiers from both sides marched through these valleys. They drank from the same creeks. They bled on the same fields. And when typhoid and measles came, as they always did in armies, Anne Reeves Jarvis did something remarkable. She asked her mother's day work clubs to remain neutral, to care for soldiers in blue and soldiers in gray alike, to wash their wounds without asking which flag they followed. After the war, when the country was raw and tender, she organized a Mother's Friendship Day, a gentle gathering in Pruntytown, where families from both sides of the war came together, sang hymns, shed quiet tears, and shook trembling hands. It is said that old soldiers wept openly as they greeted men they had once tried to kill. Anne stood among them, small and steady, holding the day together with nothing more than her conviction that mothers, of all people, knew how to mend what war had torn. In her parlor, in the long evenings, she taught Sunday school lessons to her own children. And one of those children, a serious, dark-eyed little girl named Anna, listened with particular care. There is a story, Anna would tell it many times later when she was grown, that one Sunday afternoon her mother, finishing a lesson on the mothers of the Bible, paused, looked out the window at the soft blue hills, and said something close to a prayer. "I hope," Anne murmured almost to herself, "that someone, sometime, will found a memorial Mother's Day commemorating mothers for the matchless service they render to humanity in every field of life." The little girl heard. She did not answer. She only tucked the words away, deep inside, the way a child folds a treasured leaf inside a book, to be opened, perhaps, many years later when the season is right. The years passed, the way years do, in a small town in West Virginia. Slowly, kindly, like a long afternoon that does not wish to end. The little girl who had listened to her mother's prayer grew tall, and then taller still, and the bow in her hair gave way to a careful knot at the nape of her neck. Anna. That was her name. Anna Jarvis. And though she carried herself with the seriousness of someone who had been raised in a house full of duty, there was always a softness in her eyes when she looked at her mother, Ann Reeves Jarvis, moving about the kitchen, humming, kneading bread, mending a sleeve, tending the small and steady fires of a life devoted to others. For nearly 40 years, that softness held. And then, in the spring of 1905, on a quiet morning when the dogwoods were just beginning to whisper their pale promises, Ann Reeves Jarvis closed her eyes for the last time. There was no thunder, no great drama. Only the gentle hush that falls over a house when something beloved has gone and the clocks seem to tick a little more carefully out of respect. Anna was at her mother's side. She did not weep loudly. Grief, when it is deep enough, often forgets to make a sound. She only held her mother's hand a moment longer than was needed, and let the warmth of it pass slowly out of the world, the way a candle gives its last small light to the room before going dark. The funeral was held in the West Virginia hills, in a churchyard where the grass grew long between the headstones, and the wind moved through the cedars with a sound like distant water. It was the kind of cemetery that does not feel sorrowful so much as patient. A place that has been waiting kindly for a very long time, and will go on waiting kindly after we are gone. Anna stood among the mourners in a dark dress, her gloved hands folded one over the other. The minister spoke softly. The hymns rose and settled like pale birds finding their branches. And though many things were said that day about service and about goodness and about a woman who had spent her life caring for the children of strangers as tenderly as her own, Anna heard them only at a distance, the way one hears voices through the wall of a familiar room. Her thoughts were elsewhere. Her thoughts had gone back, all the way back to a Sunday school classroom many years before, and a small prayer her mother had whispered into the quiet, a prayer that someone, someday, might find a way to honor all the mothers of the world. The treasured leaf, folded inside the book of her childhood, had begun, very softly, to open. When the service ended and the others drifted away in twos and threes, Anna remained. She stayed beside the fresh earth as the afternoon light slanted long and golden through the cedars. A robin called somewhere out past the stone wall. A breeze stirred the hem of her dress. And there, standing alone, with no one to hear her but the wind and the waiting trees, Anna Jarvis made her promise. It was not a grand vow. It was not declared. It was barely spoken at all. It came out of her in something closer to a breath than a sentence. The way a daughter speaks to a mother she still believes, somewhere deep inside, can hear her. She would do it. She would find a way. She would build the day her mother had once dreamed of, a day for all mothers, living and remembered. Not a celebration of the famous, or the powerful, or the great. A day for the quiet ones. The ones who hummed in kitchens. The ones who mended sleeves. The ones whose love went unrecorded except in the small, unbroken kindnesses of ordinary life. She did not know, then, how she would do it. She did not know that it would take years, and letters and carnations, and a small Methodist church in the green hills of West Virginia. She did not know that the promise she was making, in barely more than a whisper, would one day cross oceans. She knew only that she had given her word. And so she stood a little longer in the kind, slanted light, and let the cedars keep their gentle vigil, and laid her gloved hand once, softly, upon the earth. The way one closes a book with great tenderness on a chapter 1 is not yet ready to forget. 3 years drifted by the way certain seasons do, quietly, almost on tiptoe, the way snow gathers on a windowsill while the house sleeps, the way bread rises beneath a clean linen cloth in a kitchen warmed by an old iron stove. In a narrow row house in Philadelphia, on a modest street where the sycamores leaned together like old friends sharing a confidence, Anna Jarvis sat at a writing desk by the parlor window. The desk was a plain one, of dark walnut, worn smooth by years of patient elbows. A small green-shaded lamp pooled its honey-colored light over a single sheet of cream-laid paper. Beside it lay a bottle of blue-black ink, a blotter of soft felt, and a fountain pen with a mother-of-pearl barrel that caught the lamplight whenever her hand passed over it. The clock on the mantel ticked the way old clocks tick, unhurried, certain, unbothered by the great hurry of the world outside. Anna dipped her pen and began. "Dear Reverend," she wrote, in a careful hand that sloped just a little to the right, like wheat in a soft summer wind. "Dear Editor, Dear Honorable Governor, Dear Madam President of the Ladies, Aid." Each letter began with a courtesy, and each one carried the same quiet dream, dressed in slightly different words. A day, she proposed, only one day in the whole long calendar set aside for mothers. Not for commerce, not for spectacle, only for gratitude. Only for the wearing of a single white carnation in remembrance, or a pink one for a mother still living and well. She wrote, and the lamp hummed, and outside the window a streetcar passed somewhere far down the avenue, ringing its small bell into the dusk, like a polite cough at a parlor door. She wrote in the morning, before the kettle had fully sung. She wrote at noon, with a slice of buttered bread on a blue-rimmed plate at her elbow. She wrote in the long, cool evenings, when the gaslights came on one by one along the street outside, and the sycamore leaves whispered their old, papery hymn against the panes. She wrote to ministers in Boston and Birmingham, to mayors in St. Louis and Seattle, to senators in marble offices she would never see, and to plain-spoken country editors in towns no larger than a handful of porches. She wrote to women's clubs in Cincinnati. She wrote to schoolmasters in Maine. She wrote to a kindly merchant in Wanamaker's department store who had once tipped his hat to her in the rain. Each envelope she addressed with the slow tenderness of a gardener tying up a vine. Each stamp she pressed with her thumb as if sealing a small, hopeful prayer. She set them in a wicker basket by the door, and in the morning the postman, who knew her by name now, would touch the brim of his cap and lift the basket gently, the way one lifts a sleeping cat. The replies came in their own time. Some were warm, some were polite. Some did not come at all, and those silences she folded away too, without bitterness, the way one folds a letter that has done its work and can be set quietly aside. When her hand grew tired, she would rise and stand at the window. She would watch the lamplighter make his slow rounds, his long pole touching each lamp like a wand, blooming small yellow stars one after another along the cobblestones. She would think of her mother, of Grafton, of the little white church on the hill, of the cedars keeping their patient vigil over a quiet stone. She would touch the carnation she kept, always in a small glass on the desk, sometimes white, sometimes pink, always fresh, and breathe in its faint, clean, peppery sweetness. And then she would sit down again and dip the pen and begin another letter. Dear Sir, Dear Madam, Dear friend of mothers everywhere. There was no fanfare in any of it. No banner, no brass band, only the soft scratch of nib on paper and the gentle click of the pen returning to its silver tray, and the slow, sure breathing of one woman keeping a promise made long ago in slanted Sunday light. Outside, the city dimmed itself for the evening. A neighbor's piano played a few uncertain bars of a hymn and then fell still. Somewhere a baby was being rocked. Somewhere a window was being closed against the cool spring air. And in the little parlor on the narrow street, the lamp burned on, steady and warm, while letter after letter went quietly out into the wide and waiting world. And so the months passed in that quiet, patient way that months do when a person is working toward something they love. The leaves came back to the maples along the river. The dogwoods bloomed and dropped their soft white petals onto the lawns of Grafton. And the second Sunday of May drew near, the way a long-awaited letter draws near, in the hand of a mail carrier walking up a familiar street. May 10th, 1908. It was a gentle morning in the West Virginia hills. The mist lay low over the Tigard Valley, soft and silvery, the way a sheet is laid over a sleeping child. The river curled through the town, slow and unhurried, catching the early light in 1,000 small reflections. Birds were calling from the hawthorn hedges. A milk cart rattled somewhere down a side street, and then was still. And on a quiet corner of Main Street stood the Andrews Methodist Episcopal Church. Red brick, white trim, a modest steeple reaching gently toward a sky that was just beginning to turn from pearl to pale, pale blue. Inside, The air was cool and held that lovely smell that old churches keep in their wood, a smell of varnished pews, of well-thumbed hymn books, of furniture polish and candle wax, and the faint sweetness of last week's lilies. The morning light came in through the tall windows in long, soft bars, and dust drifted slowly through those bars, like little flakes of gold suspended in honey. At the front of the sanctuary, near the pulpit, there were boxes. Long, white, fragrant boxes. And inside those boxes, gathered close together as though for warmth, were the carnations. 500 of them. White as a winter morning. White as a christening gown. White as the soft cap a mother wears in a half-remembered dream. Anna had sent them, just as she had promised. She had wired the order weeks before to a florist who knew the kind of flower she meant. Not the bright, fluttery kind, but the calm and steady kind, with petals that look almost like folded paper. White, because her mother had loved white carnations. White, she would later say, because their hue stood for the truth, the purity, and the enduring love of a mother's heart. And 500, because she wanted enough. Enough for every mother. Enough for every child. Enough to leave none unremembered. The doors opened. The people came in slowly, the way people do on a Sunday morning when there is no hurry in the world. Old men in dark suits, walking carefully on their canes. Young mothers in simple cotton dresses, with babies asleep against their shoulders. Children scrubbed pink, with damp hair combed flat, holding their mothers' hands. Women in widow's black, walking by themselves, finding a quiet pew toward the back. And as each person stepped through the door, a carnation was placed gently into their hand. A small thing. A weightless thing. A flower no heavier than a folded prayer, and yet you could see it settle in their fingers like something larger than itself. A grandmother held hers up to her nose and closed her eyes. A boy of 7 turned his slowly between his thumb and forefinger, watching the petals catch the light. A young father pinned one carefully to the lapel of his Sunday coat, and then stood, for a moment, very still, as though listening to a voice only he could hear. The pews filled, row by row. The hymnals were drawn from their racks with that soft, dry sound that hymnals make. Throats were cleared. A baby murmured and was hushed. And in the rafters above, the swallows that had built their nests in the eaves went quietly about their morning, indifferent to history, busy with the small and ancient work of feeding their young. Reverend Howard Wade rose at the front of the sanctuary. His voice, when it came, was gentle and unhurried, the voice of a country minister who has known these families for a long time. He spoke of mothers. He spoke of the long, unseen labor of love that runs underneath every life, the way a river runs underneath a town. He spoke of Anna Jarvis, who had taught Sunday school in this very room for more than 2 decades, and whose chair that morning sat empty. And in the pews, white carnations were held in laps and pressed lightly to hearts. And outside, the mist over the valley began, very slowly, to lift. 300 miles to the east, in the great city of Philadelphia, the morning unfolded along a different rhythm, but with, somehow, the very same heartbeat. There stood, on Market Street, a building unlike any the country had ever seen. John Wanamaker's department store. A cathedral of commerce with marble floors that gleamed like still water, and a grand court so vast that organ music, when it played, seemed to rise up to meet the painted ceiling and then drift softly back down upon the shoppers below. On most mornings, the air there smelled of polished wood and new leather, of perfumed samples and roasted coffee from the tea room. But on this particular morning, that second Sunday of May, the counters were quiet. The cash registers stilled, and in the auditorium upstairs, where Mr. Wanamaker liked to host concerts and lectures and quiet moments of civic gathering, the chairs had been arranged in long, patient rows. Thousands came. They came in their Sunday hats and their Sunday gloves. They came carrying sleeping children. They came with elderly mothers leaning gently on their arms, and with the empty places beside them where mothers used to be. The men removed their hats at the door. The women adjusted the small white carnations pinned at their collars, the very same flower, on the very same day as the one held in the laps of the congregation in Grafton. It was as if a single thread had been pulled across the map, stitching one small mountain church to one grand city auditorium, and through that stitch, something quiet began to pass. Anna Jarvis herself had written to Mr. Wanamaker. She had written letters by the dozen, by the hundred, in that careful looping hand of hers, to ministers, to mayors, to newspaper editors, to anyone who might listen. And John Wanamaker, a man who had buried his own mother years before, had read her letter and answered simply yes. Yes, he would host a service. Yes, he would honor Ann Reeves Jarvis. Yes, the carnations would be white. And so, that morning in Philadelphia, hymns rose from a department store auditorium, the way hymns had once risen from a small Methodist church in West Virginia. Softly, sincerely, a sound made of many voices folded into one. And from those two places, the mountain town and the city, the idea began to drift outward. It moved, first, by railway. The trains that crossed the Alleghenies and ran along the Monongahela carried passengers home with the story tucked into their conversations, into their letters, into the pockets of their Sunday coats. A traveling salesman in Pittsburgh told it to a friend in Cleveland. A school teacher returning to Cincinnati told it to her sister. A young pastor riding the rails toward Indiana copied the order of service into a small leather notebook and tucked the notebook beside his Bible. It moved, next, by telegram. Short clipped sentences clicking down the wires in that strange Morse music. Dot, dash, dot. Carrying news of the day from Grafton and from Philadelphia out to every newspaper office along the line. By Monday morning, columns had been set in type. By Tuesday, papers from Boston to St. Louis carried small notices, tucked between the weather and the shipping news, of a new kind of remembrance. And it moved, slowest and surest of all, by church bulletin. By the small folded papers passed hand to hand in the vestibules of country chapels and city cathedrals alike. A minister in Maine read about it, and the next May his congregation wore white carnations too. A priest in New Orleans read about it, and the bells of his church rang at noon. A Sunday school teacher in Kansas read about it, and she taught her children to write thank you notes to their mothers in their best, most careful hand. It traveled the way a kindness travels. Quietly, without hurry, from kitchen to kitchen, from porch to porch, from one heart that remembered to another heart still learning how. By the time another year had turned, towns Anna Jarvis had never seen and would never see were holding their own small services. Bouquets were being laid at gravestones and places she could not have found on a map. White carnations bloomed in lapels in Vermont and Oregon, in Georgia and Wyoming, in fishing villages along the Maine coast and ranching towns out on the high plains. A single vow made beside a single grave in a single small church, spreading like the lifting of mist over a quiet valley, gentle, unhurried, reaching in its own soft way very nearly everywhere. And so we come, gently, to a Tuesday in May. The year is 1914. The world, in the months ahead, will tilt toward sorrow. But for now, on this particular morning, the air over Washington is soft and unhurried, the kind of late spring air that smells faintly of cut grass and warming stone. Cherry trees along the tidal basin have already shed their blossoms. The petals lie in pale drifts along the paths, and the new leaves have come in, tender and green. Inside the White House, sunlight moves slowly across a polished desk. For 6 quiet years, Anna Jarvis has been writing letters. Not loud letters. Not angry letters. Just patient ones in her careful, looping hand. To governors, to mayors, to senators, to ministers, to newspaper editors in towns she would never see. She has worn out fountain pens. She has worn out the corners of envelopes. She has filled trunks with carbon copies and stamps and gentle, persistent hope. She has knelt more than once beside her mother's grave in Grafton and whispered the same small promise, "I am still working on it." And now, on this particular morning, in a quiet room far from West Virginia, a tall, thoughtful man with round glasses picks up a pen. President Woodrow Wilson is not a man given to grand gestures. He is a former schoolteacher. He likes sentences that mean what they say. He reads the proclamation through, slowly, the way he reads everything. And then, with a small, deliberate motion, he signs his name. It takes him only a moment. But in that moment, the second Sunday of May becomes something it has never been before. It becomes a day set aside by the whole of a nation for the simple purpose of honoring mothers. Living mothers. Departed mothers. The mother who packed your lunch tin. The mother who taught you the names of the birds. The mother whose hands you can no longer hold, but whose voice you can still hear, somewhere, in the quietest part of your remembering. The pen lifts. The ink dries. And the room is, for a breath, perfectly still. Outside, a streetcar bell rings on Pennsylvania Avenue. A delivery boy whistles. Pigeons rise in a soft wheel against the pale sky. The news travels, as news did then, slowly and lovingly. By telegraph, in dots and dashes that click through wooden offices in lamplit towns. By the morning papers, folded and tucked under the arms of men in straw hats. By word of mouth, over fences and across kitchen tables, between neighbors leaning on porch rails in the long blue evening. Did you hear? Mother's Day. A real holiday now. In Grafton, West Virginia, the news arrives the way most news arrives in small towns, in pieces, in pleased murmurs, in the smile of the postmaster as he hands across a folded letter. The little Methodist church on Main Street, where it all began, sits quietly under its tall trees. A breeze moves through the long grass at the edge of the churchyard. A bee hums somewhere in the wild roses by the fence. And Anna sits, perhaps, by a window in Philadelphia, where she has been living with a newspaper open on her lap. Her mother has been gone now nearly 9 years. Her hair has begun to silver at the temples. Her eyes, when she lifts them to the soft afternoon light, are very tired and very bright. She does not weep, we are told. Not loudly, anyway. She only sits, very still, the way one sits at the end of a long climb, when the wind has finally stopped pulling at one's coat. She folds the paper. She presses her hand, lightly, against her heart. The promise, she thinks, has been kept. And what a gentle thing that promise has become. A whole country, on the same Sunday, pausing to think of the woman who first held them. Carnations on breakfast trays. Long-distance telephone calls crackling across the new copper wires. Letters begun with "Dear Mother" and ended with "Your loving child." Old women in rocking chairs receiving small, careful gifts from grown sons whose hands were once no bigger than a teacup. A whole country for a day remembering to be tender. It is hard to imagine now how soft a triumph that must have felt. How quiet. How complete. Outside Anna's window, the light goes slowly golden. A single white carnation, in a glass on the sill, leans gently toward the warmth. And somewhere, very far away, in a small churchyard in West Virginia, the long grass moves and the wild roses bloom, and a mother, surely, is listening. But of course, the world does not stay quiet for long. Word of Anna's small Sunday in Grafton traveled the way good news travels in those years, slowly and then all at once. A mention in a church bulletin here. A note in a women's club newsletter there. A line in a newspaper, tucked between the weather and the price of wheat. By the spring of 1910, then 1911, then 1912, Mother's Day had stepped quietly out of West Virginia and begun walking in its plain Sunday shoes across the whole of the country. And waiting for it, on every street corner, were the Florists. You can almost picture them in their long white aprons, standing in the doorways of their little shops at dawn. The bell above the door, the bucket of cool water by the counter, the smell of green stems just trimmed. For most of the year, theirs was a gentle trade. A wedding here, a funeral there, a corsage for a graduating daughter. But here, suddenly, was a holiday made entirely of flowers. A holiday that asked every grown child in America, on the same Sunday in May, to wear a single white bloom over the heart. The carnation, that humble, unfussy little flower, became, almost overnight, the most precious thing in the greenhouse. Growers in New Jersey and Ohio and faraway California began planting fields of them, long, tidy rows under glass, watched over like sleeping children. Trains pulled into Philadelphia and Chicago and New York, with whole cars full of carnations packed in damp paper. Boys on bicycles wheeled through the pre-dawn streets carrying boxes the size of small coffins, and by sunup the shop windows were white with petals, and by noon the windows were empty again. In one season, only a few years after that first Grafton service, Americans were spending more than $1 million on white carnations alone. $1 million in 1912 money. Imagine it. A whole river of small silver coins flowing toward a flower that had, not so long ago, been the favorite of one country school teacher in West Virginia. And it did not stop with the florists. Candy makers wrapped soft chocolates in pink ribbon and called them Mother's Day assortments. Department stores hung banners in their front windows. Restaurants advertised special Sunday menus. Telegraph offices stayed open late so that sons and daughters far from home could send 3 short lines across the wires and feel, for a moment, as if they had reached across the miles and touched a familiar cheek. It was in many ways a beautiful thing. A whole country pausing on the same morning to think kindly of the woman who had raised it. The streets full of small white blossoms. The post offices stacked with letters. The churches, even the little churches, full to the back pews. And yet, in a quiet boarding house in Philadelphia, a woman with neat hair and serious gray eyes sat at her writing desk and watched it all with a slowly furrowing brow. Anna Jarvis did not, at first, say anything sharp. She was, by nature, a gracious correspondent. She wrote thank you letters. She answered the requests that came pouring in from women's groups and pastors and mayors, all of them eager to know how to do the day properly. She kept her mother's white shawl folded in tissue paper in her trunk, and her mother's Bible on the table by the bed, and she allowed herself, on most evenings, to feel a quiet pride. But sometimes, walking past a shop window in early May, she would stop. She would see the carnations heaped in their tin buckets, marked at prices that climbed higher each year. She would see the printed cards with their machine-stamped sentiments, love and gratitude and devotion, all spelled out in golden ink, all costing 15 cents apiece. She would see the candy boxes shaped like hearts, and the discount signs, and the small placards in the windows. Don't forget Mother. And something in her, very gently at first, would tighten. For Anna had built this Sunday, you remember, out of one handwritten letter and one small church and 500 white carnations bought with her own slender salary. She had built it as a vow, as a thank you whispered into the quiet air of a country chapel, as a daughter's small, particular love, made visible for one morning, and then folded away again, like a Sunday dress, until next year. She had not built it. She would soon begin to feel, to be sold. But the world, of course, had other ideas. Within only a few short years of that first quiet service in Grafton, the second Sunday in May began to swell beyond anything Anna had pictured. Florists ordered carnations by the boxcar. Greeting card companies set their presses humming. Candy makers wrapped pink ribbons around heart-shaped tins and stacked them in bright pyramids near every shop window. Telegrams flew across wires in such numbers that the offices had to hire extra hands. From the outside, it must have looked like a triumph. A daughter's wish, blooming into a national tenderness. A whole country, for one morning, turning toward its mothers. But Anna, sitting at her writing desk in Philadelphia, with her mother's old Bible close at hand and a fresh stack of stationery in front of her, did not see triumph. She saw something gentler being elbowed aside. She saw the white carnation, her mother's flower, simple and unshowy, being priced higher and higher each May until working families could barely afford one. She saw the handwritten letter, the slow, careful sentence, the visit home, all of it being quietly replaced by a pre-printed card and a box of chocolates, chosen in a hurry on the way out the door. And so, in her quiet, stubborn way, she set out to defend it. She wrote letters, thousands and thousands of letters, long ones, short ones, tart ones, pleading ones. She wrote to florists and confectioners and department stores. She wrote to senators, to governors, to newspaper editors in towns she had never seen. She typed late into the evening, the soft tick of the keys keeping time with a lamp on her desk, and when her fingers grew tired, she wrote longhand, in a careful slanted script, until the inkpot was nearly dry. She picketed conventions. Imagine, for a moment, this small woman in her dark coat and tidy hat, standing at the doors of grand hotel ballrooms where candy makers had gathered for their annual banquets, calmly, firmly, refusing to move. She handed out pamphlets. She asked, in that direct West Virginia way, what exactly they thought they were selling. Once, when a confectioners group held a charity luncheon in the holiday's name, she walked right in and dismantled the centerpiece display. She was, on occasion, escorted out. She came back the next year. She tried to trademark the very words. She filed for the rights to Mother's Day itself, the apostrophe always before the S, never after singular, she insisted, because each child has only one mother to honor, not all mothers in some vague collective. She fought commercial uses of the phrase in court, in the press, in city halls. She spent her own modest inheritance on legal fees. She spent her sister Lillian's inheritance too. Slowly, year by year, the savings dwindled, like a lamp that has been left burning a little too long into the morning. And still, she would not stop. She quarreled with charities that sold flowers in her mother's name to raise money, even kindly ones, even ones doing real good. She quarreled with the First Lady, who hosted a Mother's Day fundraiser she did not approve of. She quarreled with friends, with neighbors, with anyone who suggested that perhaps a card was, after all, only a card. She had become, there is no softer way to say it, a difficult woman. The kind of woman whom history is sometimes embarrassed by, even when history owes her a great debt. Her health began to thin. Her eyesight, never strong, grew dim from all those late nights of small print and smaller type. Her hearing faded. Her hair, once dark, turned the color of the carnation she had loved. She moved into a quieter apartment, then a quieter one still. Friends drifted, busy with their own lives. The letters she sent were sometimes not answered. The ones she received sometimes called her foolish. Yet on the second Sunday of every May, no matter how tired she was, no matter how thin her purse, she would put on her good dark dress, pin a single white carnation to her collar, and sit very still by the window for a while, thinking of a small Methodist church in Grafton, and a woman in a calico apron handing a child an apple, and a promise made at a graveside on the damp spring afternoon. She had not built this day to be sold. She had built it to be remembered. And she would, with the last small coins of her strength, go on standing at its door, like a watchful daughter at her mother's bedside, refusing, gently, stubbornly, hopelessly, to let the noisy world come tramping in. The years grew quieter around her, the way a long afternoon grows quiet when the sun begins to lean toward the window. Anna's hair, once dark and pinned with such careful purpose, turned the color of winter wheat, then the color of milk left out in the cold light of morning. Her hands, which had once written 10,000 letters, folded now more often in her lap, content to rest. The fight had not left her, exactly. It had only thinned, the way a candle thins as it burns, until the flame seemed to float just above the wick, small and steady and almost weightless. In the end, she lived in a quiet sanitarium near Philadelphia, in a room with a window that let in a soft, sideways kind of sun. There were nurses who spoke to her gently, in voices like folded linen. There were neighbors who, it is said, sent flowers, carnations of course, white as the inside of a seashell, without ever telling her where the money had come from, because they knew she would have refused it. She drifted between the world that was and the world that had been, between Grafton and Philadelphia, between her mother's parlor and her own narrow bed, and somewhere in that drifting she found a kind of peace she had not allowed herself in many years. She died in 1948. She had never married. She had no children of her own to sit at her bedside, no daughter to smooth her hair the way she had once smoothed her mother's. And yet, on the day she was laid to rest, the country she had quietly given a holiday to was all around her, beginning to remember its mothers again, in small kitchens, in country churches, in city apartments where someone was setting the table for Sunday dinner. She did not see it, but it was there. It had always been there, ever since the first carnations were carried into that little Methodist church in West Virginia on a soft May morning in 1908. And that, perhaps, is the gentle truth of her story. The world she feared had grown too loud was also, in its own clumsy, hurrying way, still listening. Somewhere a child was picking a flower from a roadside. Somewhere a grown son was writing a letter he had been meaning to write for years. Somewhere a grandmother was opening a card with shaking, grateful hands. None of them knew Anna's name. None of them needed to. The day belonged to their mothers now, the way she had always wanted it to. Every May, in homes you will never visit, in countries whose languages you do not speak, her mother's favorite flower still appears. A single white carnation in a jelly jar on a kitchen table. A small bouquet pressed into the hands of a woman who is trying not to cry. A blossom laid quietly on a grave where the grass has grown tall and patient. The flowers do not know they are keeping a promise. They only know how to bloom, the way they have always bloomed, soft and white and faintly sweet, like the breath of someone you love asleep beside you. And so the story closes, the way the best stories close. Not with trumpets, but with a hush. A daughter who loved her mother. A mother who loved her neighbors. 500 carnations carried into a small white church on a hillside in Grafton, West Virginia, more than 100 years ago now, and yet, somehow, still arriving. Still being handed, gently, from one set of hands to another. Still saying, in their quiet flower language, the simple thing Anna Jarvis spent her whole life trying to say. Thank you. I remember. Outside, the night has grown deep and kind. The fire has settled into its low, glowing rest. Somewhere, a clock is ticking with the patience of a heart that has nothing left to prove. And somewhere, in a vase you cannot see, in a kitchen you have never entered, a white carnation is leaning ever so slightly toward the lamplight, the way a sleepy child leans toward the warmth of a mother's shoulder. Close your eyes now. Let the day go. Let the noise of the world soften and drift, the way Anna's footsteps softened on the long road home. The carnation is still blooming. The promise is still kept. And somewhere, quietly, in a country church on a green hillside, a daughter is whispering her mother's name into the soft May air, and the air, gentle as ever, is carrying it onward. 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 Good night.